What's going on, everybody? Kalipis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G 2023 and the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE. Now, as always, if you end up wanting to learn more about either phone individually, be sure to check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. Now, if you know anything about either of these phones, you're probably wondering what's even the point of comparing a mid-range phone like the Moto G Stylus 5G to more of a higher-end device like the S21 FE. But in general, there is actually a lot to think about here. And if you're new to smartphones, maybe you haven't gotten a new phone for quite a while, you might be wondering whether you want to get a more affordable device like the Moto G Stylus 5G, or spend a bit more and get something higher-end like the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE. And in addition to this, the S21 FE is quite a bit more affordable than it once was, so it does actually offer a lot of value for the money. But at the same time, it is getting a bit older now. It came out around January of 2022, and considering that it's August of 2023, some things about it might be a little outdated. So throughout this video, definitely keep this in mind, and also keep in mind that although I am linking to some information about pricing in the description, depending on where you're located, things could be different for you. Now, for the displays here, with the Moto G Stylus 5G, we're getting a 6.6-inch 120Hz IPS LCD display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 399, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. With the S21 FE, we're getting a 6.4-inch 120Hz dynamic AMOLED display. This phone also has a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 411, and a 19.5:9 aspect ratio. So it's a little bit wider and shorter, but I feel like just that alone is really not a huge difference. But a pretty clear difference here is that with the Moto G Stylus 5G, at again 6.6 inches versus 6.4 with the Samsung, it is a bit larger, so if you are someone who prefers a larger device, the Moto G Stylus 5G will be a better choice for you. On the other hand though, with the dynamic AMOLED versus an IPS LCD, the S21 FE has much better image quality. You might not really be able to tell a whole lot in this video, but in person when you're actually using the phones, the S21 FE does feel really premium. The colors are a bit more rich and vibrant, the display in general is a bit brighter, and the viewing angles are also a lot better. So if you're like outside in the sun for example, the S21 FE will be quite a bit easier to see. Now for storage, keep in mind both phones do have a couple different variants. On one hand, with the Moto G Stylus 5G, this phone in my hand is factory unlocked, and it does have 256GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion. But if you get it from a carrier, most carriers I want to say have only 128, so definitely keep that in mind. And with the S21 FE, this one in my hand has 128GB with unfortunately no microSD card expansion, but there is another variant that has 256. So if you do want a bunch more storage, you can get it with either phone. So honestly, despite these specific versions in my hands having different amounts of storage, I feel like since you can get 256 or 128 with either phone, it kind of evens out here. But really the main difference is that unfortunately, again, the S21 FE does not have microSD card expansion, whereas the Motorola does. And if your current device already has a microSD card in it with a bunch of information and stuff, transferring all that onto a phone that can't take a microSD card is probably going to be kind of annoying, and while that's kind of a one-time inconvenience, I can understand why you wouldn't want to deal with it. And besides, a microSD card is definitely a useful thing to have, especially if you're recording lots of videos for example. Offloading that onto a microSD card definitely helps. So if microSD card expansion is a bit more important to you, the Moto G Stylus 5G will have an advantage. But if it's really just a matter of storage, I feel like even with S21 FE, 128GB or 256 if you get the other variant, regardless, the internal storage is honestly going to be plenty for most people. So in general, if that's really what matters, I do think either phone here will be perfectly fine. For security features, both phones have Face Unlock, and they both have fingerprint scanners. With the Moto G Stylus 5G, it's on the power key, and with the S21 FE, it's in the display. But starting with the Motorola, let's try them out. There we go, one more time. And there we go. And now for the S21 FE. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, both fingerprint scanners work real well, no issues at all. And again, both phones have Face Unlock too, so definitely nice to get both options. Now for the camera setups, up front, both phones have real nice looking hole punch designs for the selfie cameras. The Moto G Stylus 5G has 16 megapixels, and the S21 FE has 32. Then on the back, with the Motorola, we got a dual camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera and an 8 megapixel ultra wide camera that also doubles as a macro camera. With the S21 FE, we got a triple camera setup with a 12 megapixel main camera, an 8 megapixel megapixel telephoto lens and a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera. And for video, both phones can record 4K videos in the rear camera. And in the front, the Moto G Stylus 5G does max out at 1080p, but the S21 FE can still record in 4K. So in general, both phones have great camera setups, and I feel like they are pretty equal when it comes to features, but I will give the advantage to the S21 FE because this phone does have a telephoto lens. And despite not having a macro camera, I feel like the telephoto lens is quite a bit more useful because it can get those close-up detailed images pretty much the same way as a macro camera can, but you also get much better zoom, whereas with the Moto G Stylus 5G, despite at least having a macro camera and an ultra wide camera too, there's no telephoto lens here, so the zoom is okay but not great. And also for the video, being able to record 4K videos in the rear camera and the front camera is definitely nice. And while with the Motorola, I am at least glad it can record 4K videos at all. It would have been nice to see it in the selfie camera too. Now to give you an idea of what these cameras can do, first, here's some pictures taken with the Moto G Stylus 5G. In general, for what it is, I do think the photo quality here is perfectly fine for most people. For regular casual use, if you're maybe posting the occasional Instagram or other kind of social media photo, it will be perfectly fine. And if you're doing stuff like sending photos to friends and family using Snapchat, where honestly for something like Snapchat, pretty much anything works. And then maybe taking photos for your own memories. For that kind of use, the Moto G Stylus 5G will be perfectly fine, and for a phone in this price range, I do think the quality is pretty impressive. And then here's some pictures taken with the S21 FE, and you can probably tell the S21 FE is on a completely different level. In fact, you probably knew this before even watching this video. But yeah, if you're looking for a phone that has really a flagship level camera, but also is pretty much the same price as your average mid-range phone, the S21 FE will definitely be a great choice. And in general, if you're really using your camera a lot and you want really good photo quality, but at the same time you still don't want to spend like $1,400 on something like an S23 Ultra, then in that case, the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE will be a great choice. Now for the RAM and processor, with the Moto G Stylus 5G, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 6 Gen 1 processor. With the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE, we're also getting 6GB of RAM here with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 888 5G processor. Now on one hand, with the Moto G Stylus 5G, for a mid-range phone, especially considering it's actually even a bit more affordable than its predecessor, going for around $399 at full price factory unlocked, whereas the Moto G Stylus 5G 2022, which is definitely not as fast. I remember paying about $500 for it when it first came out. So yeah, somehow Motorola made this phone a bit more affordable, but also quite a bit faster. So if you are looking for a really affordable mid-range phone, but you still want good performance, this phone will definitely be a great choice. That being said though, between the two, I would say the S21 FE is a bit faster, and this is probably not surprising because after all, despite being over a year and a half old, this is still a flagship phone, and while not being the top of the line, it still definitely is quite a bit faster than your average mid-range phone. So even though compared to other mid-range phones, this comparison is a bit closer when it comes to performance, the S21 FE is still noticeably faster, so if performance is really a main priority for you, definitely keep this in mind. Now I ran a benchmark test on each phone here using Geekbench 6, and here are the results I got. So again, as you can see here, based on this, the S21 FE is quite a bit faster, and I would say from my own experience, this is pretty accurate. So on one hand, if you're doing more basic activities, where you might be on your phone a bit more but your needs are still really not that complex, the Moto G Stylus 5G will be perfectly fine, and again, compared to your typical mid-range phone, this definitely will be quite a bit faster. But still, if you're really more of a power user, the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE will still be on a completely different level. So again, if the performance is really a priority for you, definitely keep this in mind. When it comes to the batteries, the Motorola actually has a bit of an advantage with a 5000 mAh battery supporting 20W fast charging versus the S21 FE with a 4500 mAh battery that supports 25W fast charging. And also keep in mind the S21 FE, like most higher end devices, does have wireless charging. So if you do want that feature, it is a nice thing to have. But in general, if you want better battery life and longevity, the Moto G Stylus 5G will have an advantage. Now I will say in my experience, I've used the S21 FE quite a bit. In fact, for a while I was using it to record all the videos on this channel, and I've actually had a pretty good experience with the battery. It's lasted a decent amount of time and it doesn't overheat or anything, at least not for me. So I really have no complaints here. But at the same time, the Moto G Stylus 5G still is going to have much better battery life. So if you're maybe on your phone a bit more, maybe you're traveling a lot or in some kind of situation where you're really not always around a charger, this is something to think about. But in a regular indoor environment where you're usually able to plug your phone in, at least for a decent amount of time, in that kind of situation, again, just keep in mind, despite not being quite as good as the Moto G Stylus, the battery with the S21 FE is really not that bad. For the software, both phones have Android 13, but keep in mind, when it comes to software support, even with an older phone like this, Samsung is quite a bit better. On one hand with the Motorola, while I feel like after Android 14 comes out, this phone definitely could eventually get it. With the S21 FE, you can expect to get Android 14, 15, and 16, so definitely quite a few updates. With Motorola, I feel like the updates are kind of unpredictable, whereas with the Samsung, again, this phone is over a year old now, so it's not going to get quite as many updates as, say, an A54 5G that came with Android 13, but at the same time, you can still expect to keep this phone for multiple years and still get the latest software, so definitely worth considering. When it comes to other features, I already went over how the S21 FE does have wireless charging, so definitely a cool feature. In addition to this, both phones have NFC, so you can use tap and pay with either of them. And then of course, as the name implies obviously, the Moto G Stylus 5G does have a stylus, so definitely cool. If you want a Samsung with a stylus, or at least a recent model, you are going to have to spend like $1,400 on an S23 Ultra, so definitely worth considering. And in general, if you are looking for a mid-range phone that has a stylus, you're definitely not going to go wrong with this phone. I mean, as you can see, it is pretty responsive, probably not enough to do any real art or anything, but it gets the job done. And if you're just navigating through your display, maybe playing a game or something like that, despite not being the most amazing thing ever, for what it is, it does work pretty well. But in conclusion, which of these phones makes the most sense for you? In general, it's actually pretty close, and as you can probably imagine, it does really depend on your needs and preferences. On one hand, if you don't mind having a slightly smaller display but you also want really good image quality, then for the display, the S21 FE will have an advantage. But if you just want a larger display, then keep in mind, the Motorola still has a really nice looking image too, and it's not like if you're watching videos you're gonna get a bad experience with it. The display is larger, so that's always good, and despite not having the nice premium look of a dynamic AMOLED, I do think we are getting a pretty nice image here. The Motorola also has more storage, and really the reason I say this is, although the S21 FE does have a version with 256 gigabytes too, first of all, it doesn't have microSD card expansion, and second of all, I feel like with the S21 FE compared to the Motorola, the higher storage variant is a bit harder to come by. I haven't really looked very hard, but I know every factory unlocked version of the Moto G Stylus 5G does have this much storage, whereas with the Samsung, I feel like the common version does have 128, so definitely keep that in mind. I'm guessing it's probably not going to be a huge deal for most people, but again, if you are more of a power user, the Moto G Stylus 5G might be a little bit more appealing to you. When it comes to the cameras, that's an area where the S21 FE is definitely significantly better. Again, the photo quality is better, and I feel like having a telephoto lens does make a difference. But at the same time, if you're not really using your camera that much, and you really just want something decent that works, the Motorola will still be perfectly fine. Also, the S21 FE is quite a bit faster, and it does have better software support too. So in general, I feel like if your needs are really not that complex, or you're looking for an affordable phone with a stylus, the Moto G Stylus 5G will be a better choice for you. But if you want a more premium device with a nicer looking image, a better camera, a faster processor, and better software support, then in that case, you will be better off with the S21 FE. But this concludes my comparison between the Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G 2023 and the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE. Again, if you want to learn more about either phone individually, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.